Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Hi. Welcome to our 12th meetup. For the ones that are here for the first time, my name is Sara Mesquita and my friend Coro Doye. We decided to create Data Visualization Lisboa to promote data viz community in Portugal, bringing together people that want to transform raw data into expressive and effective data visualizations. And for that, we organize events, workshops, talks, discussions. This time, we collaborate with Portuguese Women in Tech, another local community created in 2016 that aims to attract more women to technology. And they also organize events and workshops around the topic. And they have a very cool website, by the way. You can find a lot of important information there. Like, for example, salary transparency. If you want to know how much people earn in your role, you can go there and check. Also, they have also a very cool initiative, book club, that will happen in the end of each month, I believe in the last Saturday. This time will be Portuguese, Portuguese, Invisible Women. So it's a very nice book. I totally encourage you to check their website and get involved. It's very important. And today with us, we have D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. We are very happy. And thank you so much for your time. And now, Coro.
Yes, here they are. Hello and welcome to the show. Katarina is a hacker mama, a scholar, artist, designer who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. Currently, she is an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. And she is the director of the Data and Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. And also welcome Lauren. She is an associate professor in the Department of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods of Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. She works at the intersection of data science, digital humanities, and early American literature, with a research focus on issues of race and gender. And I'm pretty sure you heard about their book that they both published, The Data Feminism, which is a trade book that explores the intersection of feminist thinking and data science. It charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practice. And they will now reveal some more insights of that and take us with them into the topic of data feminism. And I'm super happy that you're going to share some ideas and insights with us. So the stage is now yours.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Thanks for the invitation. It's also just great to know that the group is happening. So kudos to you all for creating something and bringing together a community like this. I won't spend any more time really on our introductions because we've already been introduced, but we're basically here today to talk to you about our book, Data Feminism. So what we want to do first is explain a little bit about our motivation for writing the book, and then just do a very kind of basic definition of intersectional feminism before we dive into some examples from that come out of the book that we talk about in the book. And so we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for creating racist, classist, and sexist data products. So, here we are gathering numerous examples of these, but these are the examples of these kinds of oppressive data products are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and more. And a lot of this work that we're referencing, you can see down at the bottom of this slide. These are some of the inspirations, I guess I would say, that we were drawing from and learning from as we were writing Data Feminism. And sort of what we see is that we see kind of like two narratives about data. So on the one hand, we have this this meme, I guess I would call it, this data is the new oil. And so this is this meme that was started about data back in, I don't know, early 2010s, more or less, by The Economist magazine. And what they mean by this is that they mean that metaphor of oil, they mean it in a positive way. They mean that you can literally extract data, mine data like a natural resource, and then do your processing and analysis magic, and then turn it into profit. But of course, feminism would always say, profit for whom? And this is a lot of the pushback that we say, and the pushback that we really have been inspired by is from women of color, from white women, from indigenous people, from immigrant communities. And what we see these communities saying over and over again in different ways is that data is the same old oppression. It's just wearing new clothes, but it's the same perpetuation of an unjust status quo. And so we wanted to write a book that sort of engages with this specifically from a feminist perspective. So just to give you a little bit of a, kind of what we bring to the conversation is this focus on intersectional feminism. And so we want to do just a little bit of definition and level setting, because there are many definitions of feminism out there. And we want to tell you a little bit about our definition, because it is fairly specific. So first of all, following Beyonce, one definition comes from her, which is the feminist is a person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So feminism is on the one hand a belief in equal rights. And then secondly, this belief, if you believe in equal rights for all genders, you'd have to only just look around you outside your window and see that the world does not ensure those equal rights. So feminism also implies action, like we need to take action to achieve those equal rights. So feminism is also organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. And here I'll turn it over to Lauren to continue.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. We're, again, just such an honor to be here among this esteemed group of participants in your series. And then also, we just really appreciate your taking the time to listen to us today. So Catherine was saying, so feminism is both this belief or sort of set of beliefs about the equality of genders, and it's also action that you can take in order to see that equality actually take place in the world. And then feminism is also this interesting set of theories and ideas. And these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But really sort of the past maybe 40 years of scholarship and then also the current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality to the conversation. So this includes gender, but it also includes race and class and sexuality and ability and more. And this leads to really like the most important takeaway from this brief intro, which is that feminism right now, in the year 2020, this awful year, must be understood as intersectional. So this term is, it was coined by a specific person, the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and she uses it to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. When we talk about inequality or oppression, we must be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. Again, so this includes sexism, but also racism and classism and colonialism and so on. And the really important thing to understand about intersectionality, and this is actually something that's often overlooked, you see this phrase a lot now, but the popular definition sometimes glosses over this really important detail, which is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity and their effects, like I am a woman, I am white, I am cisgender, things like this. What it describes are the structural forces of power and their intersection that create those effects. So the privilege that I experience as a white person is a result of a larger force of power. The oppression that I experience sometimes as a woman is a result of a larger structural force of power. And so intersectionality is really trying to call attention to how these larger forces in the world come together to result in unique experiences that individuals and groups have as they sort of live in the world. And really, it's the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about structural forces. And then sort of one final historical note to say about this is that Kimberly Crenshaw, while she coined the term, and she certainly should get the credit for that, this concept, the idea of intersectionality, was described by others before her. So probably most famously, the Combahee River Collective in the late 1970s described systems of oppression as, quote, interlocking. So that was sort of their metaphor. And then even before that, in the 19th century, there were Black women scholars and activists like Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Harper, Sojourner Truth. And these women described intersectionality in practice, if not by name. So to sort of sum up, intersectional feminism it really provides the underlying framework for our book. It's not just about women and gender. It's really a question of power. It's about who has that power and who doesn't. And in today's world, as you can see on the slide, and we really believe this, data is power. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and help it be changed. And so our argument, really in a single line, is really that data science needs feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances that we encounter in our data work and in our data systems. So now I'm going to pass back to Catherine.
So as Lauren and I were writing the book, we looked at a lot of prior work, both in academia and scholarship, but also in activism, also in art and design, and drew from kind of all of those different fields and different worlds from feminist work, and in particular looked at work that tries to operationalize feminism, tries to take feminist thought and sort of put it into practice. And we asked ourselves also, what have we learned from all this schooling we've done in feminism and also our participation in various activist communities? We came up with these 7 principles, and this is also how we structure the book. So each chapter talks about one of these principles. And so these for us encapsulate the most important aspects of intersectional feminism as they relate to data. So these are like kind of tools that you can think with, things that you should be thinking about as you work with data. And so, like I said, our goal was to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a kind of a conceptual framework for people who are already working with data, for people who want to work with data, and also for people who want to refuse to work with data, because that refusal is also really important, particularly when we're talking about data systems that are extremely harmful for specific people and communities. And so what we're going to do from here, we don't have, the 12 hours it would take to talk about all of these principles. So we're going to talk about just a couple of examples from the book to give you sort of a flavor for how we talk about them. One of our goals, for those of you who have read the book or read parts of the book, you know that our style is very example driven. So we like to show not only like, here's how it would be ideally, visualized in the future, we would all challenge power, but actually show in practice, like people are doing this work already. And so that's sort of what we try to surface in the book, is people who are already following these principles of data feminism, innovating and enacting them. So we'll do 3 or 4 quick examples from the book, and then close up and hopefully have a good amount of time for questions. So yeah, Lauren, I'll pass back to you to talk about this principle.
Thank you.
Power.
Yeah, so examining power is the first principle in the book. And it's the first because it's really central to the feminist project, as we've both been talking about already, because at root, gender inequality is a question of power. And one of the contributions of feminist organizers and activists, and also theorists, is to give us models that show how power operates in the world. So, for example, the famous Black feminist sociologist, Patricia Hill Collins, describes power as what she terms the matrix of domination, by which she means that power operates not just from the top down, like the government saying women can't vote, or certain people from certain countries can't live here, things like this, but across many layers of society. And we go into this in a lot more detail in the book, but the key point here is that once we have a conceptual model for how power works in the world, we can start to understand how it operates right now, and then how to change it. And so in the book, we tell the story of Mimi Onuoha's efforts to collect what she calls missing data sets. So these are data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So data sets like transgender people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or, and this is fairly US specific, but people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. Or, a more topical example that we'll talk more about in a minute, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States. So one version of Onuoha's project is a GitHub repository, which you can see on the right. It lists the missing data sets. But another is a physical artwork. It's this file cabinet that you can see on the left with folders. And each one has a label of one of the data sets. And the idea is that you tab through the folders and look at the labels, and you presumably would find one that seems interesting to you. But then when you would go to open up the folder, and there would be nothing inside because the data set is missing. And Onuoha has written a pretty powerful artist statement. And in that, she explains that these missing data sets, quote, reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. And so by calling attention to these data sets as missing, she also calls attention to why these data sets are missing. They're missing because of a lack of personal, social, political, or governmental will. Or some combination of all of those. Or, as in the case of the coronavirus tests in our country, they're missing precisely because of political and governmental will. But in either case, because the data are missing, we cannot move forward with our goal of using those data to work towards greater justice in the world.
So just to keep going with this theme of missing data, in the chapter, there are things we can do about missing data, and there are people who are doing something when we don't have a data that describes an important problem. So for example, the case of feminicide data in Mexico, and also in almost every other country out there. Feminicide data, this is another case of missing data sets. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero. So she resolved to head straight towards this problem and collect the data herself. So just to give you a little bit more context about this issue, feminicide is gender-related killings of women and girls. It includes cis and trans women. Feminicide or femicide is actually legally defined as a crime in almost every single Latin American country. Just Cuba and Haiti are the only ones who don't have legislation about femicide. So there's legislation in Mexico that criminalizes this practice. However, the state does not systematically collect data on the problem. So you can't really even know the scope of the problem, nor can you implement measures to address it if you don't even know what's happening. Feminicide is also the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So I would encourage folks to go look at the hashtag #MeUnaMenos because of the way in which the state is neglecting to fully implement its own laws. And so Salguero was frustrated by this lack of action, by the lack of data. And so working for the past 5 years, she has single-handedly compiled the largest archive of public feminicide data in Mexico. She spends around 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicides on a Google map that she calls for media reports. She has helped families locate their loved ones who were missing. She's provided data to journalists and to NGOs, and she's even been brought before Mexico's Congress multiple times to testify about the matter. And so in the book, we talk about this. This is a form of feminist counter data. So it's producing counter data, which is activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this, for us, represents a way to use data to challenge power. And it's just important to note one sort of caveat here, which is that not all problems can be addressed by collecting counter data. So counter data may be important in certain situations, but we talk about how, we mentioned frequently in the book, how data can be a very double-edged sword, meaning more data does not always mean better, right? So sometimes when you have more data, especially about vulnerable people, you are actually putting them at risk, particularly if you are showing the data to the state or another powerful institution. And in the book, we address other strategies, not just collecting counter data, but other strategies to challenge power, which include auditing algorithms, teaching data science with a feminist lens, and centering justice in data science instead of ethics. And then just one, kind of relating to our current context, what is really interesting right now, what's going on in the US context, we're seeing actually a lot of interesting counter data collection efforts happening here. And actually just yesterday, there's the politicization of COVID data has been happening here. COVID has been very politicized here already. Data are also politicized. So the White House recently sort of like demoted our Center for Disease Prevention, our like main public health body. It removed responsibility for tracking COVID data from that body and handed it over to a different agency, Health and Human Services, which is caused kind of a huge uproar in the public health community, and it's unclear what's going to happen. At the same time, the official data, there's been a lot of problems already, even when the CDC was collecting the official data, which has prompted the New York Times and then this independent COVID tracking project, Data for Black Lives, and the Solutions Journalism Network to all mount their own counter data collection efforts. And some of them are tracking all cases. Data for Black Lives is specifically tracking who is releasing data by race and ethnicity so that we can track the disproportionate outcomes on Black and brown folks, and so on and so forth. And then for most of these efforts, they are all still missing sex and gender data, which is just notable to take into account. Okay, so I think I'll pass to Lauren now to move on to a next principle.
Sure. So we haven't yet talked about probably one of the most prominent ideas that comes from feminism, which has to do with the artificial distinctions that societies set up between categories, and then the implied hierarchies that come along with them. And so the distinction between the idea of man and the idea of woman is the obvious reference point, since it's a clear example of both a false binary and also an unequal hierarchy, right? So there are more than two genders, and among them, no one gender is better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and to use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. And you see this in the questioning of the distinction between nature and culture. It's why feminists really like cyborgs. You see this in the distinction between subject and object, which you see a lot in conversations about like knowledge and expertise, and you know, like who was it, the teacher, the student? Should there be that distinction? And you see that in the one that this example is going to help us think through, which is the distinction between reason and emotion. And so in this sort of like Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So best practices for data visualization often involve things like clean design, a minimal aesthetic, and presenting just the facts. But in the book, we talk a lot and we question why these are our best practices, especially when visualization research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally as we do others. We actually tend to believe that minimal sort of clean design is more truthful than it actually is. And so this is talking about research by Jessica Holman in particular, Helen Kennedy. These folks have shown that, for instance, like just including a source line for the data doesn't need to be a real one, but if you see like source : something, it makes people trust visualizations more. It really doesn't matter whether or not the credit line actually describes an existing source or not. But what about the opposite? And this is something we talk about in the book in more depth. So visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. So what you're seeing right now in the larger images are actually of an animation. So it's by the design firm Periscopic. And you can actually Google the title of it, like Gun Deaths United States Periscopic, and you can watch it while I'm talking. That would actually be a better representation of me just telling you what you see. But if you don't feel like doing that, I'll tell you. So this visualization is of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in the year 2013. And as you watch, each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single little orange arc. They start out slow, and they get faster and faster until they create this web of arcs that you see in the larger image. And it's really, when you watch it, it's really overwhelming. It's almost unbearable. Like you think it's going to be done. You know, the space is entirely occluded. You're like, okay, it must be done already. But then it continues for, you know, seconds, if not a minute more. And that is kind of the point, right? There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. It is an epidemic in the same way that more medical conditions are as well. And what's also interesting is that methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study. So you can read about their methods. They have them listed on the site. The data about the people derived from a national crime data set from the US government. Their projected lifespans are determined using a model which comes from the World Health Organization, which is country and location specific. But nevertheless, this visualization was viewed with real suspicion from the visualization community when it was released, primarily because it made us feel. And a feminist approach here would say, that's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. It refuses to separate the two. It says that no one is better than the other. And what this allows us to do, this sort of rebalancing from reason up top and emotion on the bottom, if you sort of go like this, rebalancing reason and emotion really opens up the data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what truly matters in the design process. So things like honoring context, really architecting attention, and taking action to dismantle some of these binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in our attempts to reimagine the world. Catherine, can you just do the next slide?
Yeah, to see it?
No.
It should say embrace pluralism.
Okay, now I do. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. So feminism, it doesn't just help us identify issues to address, but it can also inform the process of data science work. And when we talk about data science work, we really mean the whole pipeline, from sort of research, design, and data collection, to analysis, to visualization, to the reception of these images and ideas. So this principle derives from Donna Haraway, the feminist theorist, her idea of situated knowledge, and her view that the most complete knowledge comes from bringing together multiple perspectives. So in this model, and again, hopefully you're starting to sort of see themes here, like dismantling of hierarchies. So knowledge is not top-down, not just going from expert to viewer or teacher to student, but it's created through dialogue and exchange. But ultimately, her argument, which is one that we believe, this results in a more complete picture of the problem at hand. And in the book, we tell the story of this example, the anti-eviction mapping project, which is the large image on the left. It's also known as the AEMP. They are a self-described collective of, quote, housing justice activists, researchers, data nerds, artists, and oral historians. And since 2013, the AEMP has worked to quantify and organize around the housing crisis in San Francisco. They work in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups, and they also create oral histories, which is partially what you see here in this narratives of resistance and displacement map. So each blue dot on the map leads to a video story from a person or a family who is facing displacement from their home. And in the book, we contrast this map with the work of the Eviction Lab, which is the smaller image you can see on the right. This is a project based at Princeton University, and the Evictions Lab goal is related. It's to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And it's a worthy goal. It's a valuable project. And you would think that it would be very well aligned with the San Francisco-based or Bay Area-based work of the AEMP. But it's wildly different in terms of process. So the Eviction Lab's maps derive from seemingly bigger data. And the map, it seemingly presents a more comprehensive picture of the problem in the United States. I mean, just look at it, right? It's the whole country. But the AEMP has shown that the national real estate databases, like the ones that the Eviction Lab uses, significantly undercount evictions. Because there's legal definitions of eviction, and then there's all sorts of informal ways that you can get evicted, like the landlord, not fixing your plumbing, or not turning on the heat, or threatening you, or things like this. These are not recorded in the official count of evictions. But when you work with local tenants' rights organizations, you can gather data on these other kind of evictions as well. And what the data that the AEMP has gathered, this data is messier, but it's actually more comprehensive and arguably more accurate than this sort of large-scale data that you see in use in the Eviction Lab's work. And what this leads to is documentation that captures a greater extent of the problem at hand. So one quick final note before I pass back to Catherine. And this has to do with sort of how you actually put these ideas into work. So, when we say embrace pluralism, this is the principle in the design process, without any constraints, that would mean listening to everyone. But, as anyone knows, we are all facing, limited time, limited resources. You can't talk to every single person who's involved in a project. So whose voices do we prioritize? And Catherine, can you just show the next slide?
It should have come through for you.
Oh, okay. I don't know why there's a lag. Okay. Yeah, now I'm seeing it.
Lag.
Okay.
Yeah.
So following the work of people like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Shawin Bardzell, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and centers the experience of people who are at the edges and the margins first and foremost. And you sort of make decisions about both design and process from the outside in. So we have at the bottom a quote from the Design Justice Network, which is another great resource to look for if you want sort of like practical advice for how you could actually incorporate some of this into your own work. They write, "We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process." And so these are the folks who we should be working really hard with to build relationships with. Okay.
So this brings us to one of the last points that we want to make as part of this presentation, which is that data feminism really requires an expanded definition of data science. So what counts as data science? Kind of what things we say are inside data science, what things we say are outside. And we would say that data science is not about the size of your data. Like you can do data science with small data, with qualitative data. Data science also is not about the sophistication of the data analysis methods. So it doesn't have to be like super fancy to be data science. It's also not about the technical credentials of the people who are working with data science. You don't need a PhD to do data science. Precisely because these kinds of things, size, technical sophistication, credentials, eliteness of places they're affiliated with, these kinds of things are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than just purely technical. And so once we expand our definition, and our book is written with this expanded definition in mind, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, community organizations, activists. And so here we want to give a shout out to a couple of these. So like on the left here, you see Margaret Mitchell and her team for doing research on bias in natural language processing. In the center, we have artist Stephanie Dinkins, who she's pushing the boundaries and the scale of data with this, what you're looking at is an interactive talking sculpture. And it was actually, it's like an AI chatbot, and it was trained on an intergenerational dialogue between Black women in her own family. On the right, you see the Pudding's inventive and fun data journalism, which looks at bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then on the bottom, this long mural is done by Data Therapy, and they work with community-based organizations to create data murals for communities. So all of these different things we would count as being data science, and we would advocate that this more expansive definition allows us to recognize more people who are doing this work, and also recognize where the innovation is happening, because it's often happening on the fringes, particularly if what we're talking about is using data science for justice. It's all happening in these other places and not just in sort of technical corporate government circuits. And then so finally, we like to end with action. So we sort of have a slide always about like what can we do from here? So thinking about how do we translate these things into action? We can examine power. So do work that specifically interrogates and exposes racism, sexism, and other forces of oppression. These are macro forces, so they're particularly well suited to being visualized and examined with large-scale methods. They're big forces. They need big sort of macro-scale tools. So looking at how those forces show up in data and AI in the world is an important first step. We can challenge power. So thinking about collecting counter data and missing data. How do we use data to hold powerful institutions to account? Using data to advocate for equity at whatever institutions you all are coming from, institutions, organizations, groups, etc. And we can teach newcomers about data. We can bring more people into the fold using inclusive teaching methods. We can elevate emotion and embodiment, so experimentation with creative forms of data presentation and communication. There's so much amazing stuff going on in the sort of art and design world, quilts, sculptures, murals, virtual reality. There's even data-driven fashion shows that we didn't have time to show you. There's some amazing stuff out there. Once we can start to say, oh, emotion counts, emotion is included, then we can see the amazing stuff that's happening. embrace pluralism, like we were just talking about, include more people in your data process, and think really carefully about which people do we need to be at the table with us right now, designing this thing that is going to impact their community. And then finally, make labor visible, thinking about how we credit our data sources, how we make our processes transparent, and really importantly, how we reflect on our own identities and positionalities in relationship to the work. So that's it, and you can reach out. All of our information about the book is at datafeminism.io. We were running a reading group for 9 weeks where we had an hour-long session about each book, and if you go to datafeminism.io, you can see the hour-long videos are all listed there if you want to do a real deep dive into a single chapter. And then obviously feel free to reach out to us and get in touch. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for the presentation. Now it's time for some questions, and we can start with our questions, and then maybe people on YouTube are not shy anymore and can also participate on that. So we start with this one. So in your idea, how to get more resources invested in collecting equal data? How can we do this? How can we collaborate with national institutions? How can we start?
Yeah. Well, I love that you mentioned resources, because that's one of the key insights that sometimes we forget. And it's also why we have these cases of missing data, is that data are in fact very expensive to collect, they're expensive to maintain, they're expensive to use because we need people with certain kinds of training. So I appreciate that the question focuses on the resource side of things. Yeah, and I think in that case, it's from wherever we are, is lobbying our own institutions for really thinking carefully about these issues of equity and data. When we do things quickly, the quick timeline, who do we miss? And this is what we see in the US context right now. There's these huge racial disparities and also sex and gender disparities, and they're not quite as large, but that we see these happening, and yet we also cannot measure them precisely because we haven't we don't have good data standards for how we should be collecting this data, and we don't have an aggregating agency that's rolled it all up. So we basically just haven't prioritized it. And so for me, this is what leads into the political realm. This to me, these are political questions because they're questions of how do we allocate resources. So I would say mobilizing one's own community to lobby for those changes. I think that's the most important thing. And I don't know if Lauren has another take.
I mean, I think just what I would add on to that is that there's also a case that this leads to better data science or data visualization or whatever, when you have a more accurate sense of the picture at hand, whether it is because you have better categories that more accurately represent the issue or the communities that you're trying to help, whether it's some sort of policy change that you're trying to advocate for, whether it's a phenomenon that you're trying to visualize and therefore draw attention to it. The more the more complete data that you have, that just leads to better work in the end. And I think ultimately that is an argument that should resonate with almost everyone, right? Everyone wants their work to be better and actually reflect the problem that they were setting out to resolve. And you can't make the sort of big claims that you want to make if you don't have data that represents the true extent of the issue that you're trying to make those claims about.
Yeah, before I add from audience one more question from us, because that really relates on that one, and that's how can I, as a consumer of database, determine the lack of equal data, since often InfoVis is missing from which groups the data are even collected. They're often shown neutral. And yeah, even of nowadays data policies. So what's your idea?
Go ahead, Lauren.
No, you go.
Well, I think when it pertains to groups, like, I think one of the things that one can do is notice when there's like an other category, like I was just talking with somebody about one counter data effort, which is the Washington Post collects police killings. So we have in the US, we have no federal database of citizens who have been killed by police, but the Washington Post collects that information. And yet, I was talking with an indigenous woman who was very critical of their effort because Native folks are often involved in these police killings, and they don't have a category for Native Americans, for example. So they have just this it's like a white, black, and Hispanic ethnic category, and then like other categories. And so this is like a deep oversight. So I think it's sort of being suspicious when we see other, and thinking carefully about which categories are depicted and which are not depicted. For example, the same will go for data visualizations about gender or sex, where they're only showing binary categories. So they're only showing men and women, and they're not showing other genders, like non-binary folks or whatever. And so kind of knowing to look for those kinds of things. But I agree, I think it's super tricky because the conventions of data visualization are often very certain. They lend themselves to this kind of truth factor, objectivity that leads people not to necessarily question.
Yeah, even nowadays, this data is taken as this is like how do you say, like this is the truth.
Yeah.
So that's a really difficult topic we had also in our past talks to talk about, and it's a really tricky thing. So how do you see it? Even us working with data, with visualizations, knowing a bit more about that, it's like even I can't all the time tell if I don't have a look really in the data set. So
totally.
Yeah.
I totally agree. What were you going to say, Lauren?
I was just going to say, one other thing that we talk about in the book too has to do with when you are a designer or you're working on a project and you just sort of receive the data and you can't, you weren't involved in its collection, and you look at it and you think, this doesn't have all the categories I was hoping for, or I need to throw out this small category either because, it doesn't have enough statistical power, or because it might put these individuals at harm. You can always just do like a little asterisk and at the bottom say the data set did not include X or Y or Z, or the category of other includes this. You can always editorialize in a single comment. Actually, that's one thing that we did, honestly, in response to feedback primarily from trans folks who, looked over the draft of our manuscript and said, like, you have all these examples of gender, but so many of them have to do with the gender binary. And we thought, initially in the writing that we were describing the work. And they said, like, you really have an obligation to call out the fact that these projects do not acknowledge non-binary gender. And it's not that hard to do. You just add another sentence after the project. Like, this is a project that does this. It does not consider non-binary gender. And I think it just a line like that, whether it's below the visualization, whether it's included in the report, whether it's a footnote, can go a long way to prompting these responses, both among the people working on the data analysts, and then also just the viewers or the receivers of this information. And I found even the process of doing that for our book just has sort of cultivated a practice in me now, where any project that I encounter that is about groups of people, I now always ask, like, well, who are the groups? How are they collected? And I go looking for it in an appendix or the methods or whatever. And if it's not there, I sort of keep in the back of my mind, well, there is some stuff about this that we don't know.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have one more question here from the audience. How do you reconcile including emotion in data science or visualization with keeping it objective and unbiased by the author's view?
It's a great question, and a great question. And I think the feminist response is that actually the goal is not to be objective and unbiased. So, and this is coming from folks like Donna Haraway and Sandra Harding and their critiques of what they would call kind of masculinist science tradition, which has kind of promoted objectivity, but that kind of objectivity that only serves the groups in power. And so what they offer instead is feminist objectivity, which basically means that we bring ourselves into the work. So I bring in, and I like intentionally embrace my bringing in of my position in history, my position in geography, my culture, and like I kind of acknowledge it as both an asset and also as a potential risk, because, you know, it's like, because I am white, I don't have the experience of being a person of color in the United States. So that means I might miss certain things that might be very important if I'm working on a project about race, for example. But their solution to that, you know, the fact that we are limited creatures as individuals, we could never have all world experiences, is that thing of pluralism. So it's like multiplying yourself so that you're not limited just by your own individual perspective, but you bring many perspectives to the table. So what a feminist objectivity is pooling those knowledges so that we can get a little bit closer to something that is more inclusive. And so they offer that as kind of a antidote to this sort of Western Enlightenment idea of separating oneself from the research or from the world, which feminist theorists would say that's like impossible. It's an impossible ideal, and we can't do that, and it's failing us.
Yeah, and I think the point is, as Catherine said, like this idea of objectivity truly, like there's no such thing as this sort of godlike perspective that will be an objective perspective, but more complete knowledge is possible, right? Like you can get a more complete picture of what's going on. You can't just get like a single godlike view. And if you bring together these multiple perspectives, the more the better, then it will contribute to this sort of like filling in the gaps and this more complete knowledge.
Yeah, and improves more awareness that there might be more differences even between other groups and stuff, even if you're missing the data. So I think it's about quotation, right? Like, and really what you say, multiple views.
Yeah, and I think also the thing to remember is this is true even for scientific research. You know, like scientific research is always motivated by a research question that is formulated by the researchers, right? Like that is their perspective, and that the data is collected according to particular, a particular experimental setup or a sensor that was built to capture certain things or whatever. And this doesn't, and this again doesn't devalue that evidence. But it just acknowledges the fact that everyone approaches research, approaches science or design or whatever, with a goal in mind. And that goal, again, like if you make that goal more explicit, it helps to contextualize the work. It helps you understand what it's telling you. And then it also helps you to understand the limits of its applications.
Great. We have here another one. More personal one. So what topics are you focusing on these days for your research? Catherine and Lauren, who wants to start?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Sure. Yeah, watch out. You ask about our own research and then it's an hour later. I think I'm speaking for Catherine here too, but I think both of us, like we intended data feminism to be steps to action. And it was, in many ways, it was sort of like a synthesis of our work, but also sort of prompting ourselves to try to do the work that we talk about in the book. And so for me, my research expertise has to do with actually the 18th and 19th centuries, so a lot of historical work. So I'm trying to use some primarily text analysis methods to try to get at some feminist, sort of important feminist ideas that I think are sort of not talked about as much in this historical work, but could be. So questions about like labor, like how do people talk about labor? What is the labor that people are actually doing in this historical context? And are there ways that like large scale methods of analysis can bring that to the surface? Like, I think there are. I'm trying to do similar sort of ideas about historical organizing practices and their connection to contemporary justice movements, looking at if there's ways that network analysis and then also linguistic analysis can point to some important actors that might have been overlooked in sort of the dominant stories of who gets credit for leading certain charges. So, stuff like this, like I'm really trying to, and, it's not to say that we weren't doing it before, but I think the process of writing the book really sort of clarified for me, like the research questions that should be pursued at this moment and the ones that maybe could be backburnered given the current political demands.
Yeah, and for my part, same, very much in terms of kind of taking what we've done with the book and moving it forward. And so one of the things I've gotten really interested in because of our research on the book was the topic of feminicides. And also once I started talking with more folks who do work like Maria Salguero's, I realized that it's not only Maria Salguero is an amazing person, but it's not only her in Mexico that's collecting this counter data on feminicide, but this is actually a practice throughout Latin America and also in the US and also in other countries as well. But I'm working on a project that is focused in the Americas. And so right now, working with a couple of collaborators who are based in Latin America to start to build some tools and technologies to help automate the monitoring of feminicide, specifically to support some of this counter data collection work. So we're both building technology to support activists, and then I would say we're also building some social infrastructure and kind of linking together the work of activists who are often, like Maria, they have the most complete collection that's public-facing of women's deaths. And so, like, it's really important work, and yet, it needs, it's often it's not remunerated. It's like invisible labor. It's a lot of the things that we talk about, and it's also very affective labor. It's emotional labor because, of course, we're talking about death. And many of the activists do this work as a way of memorializing the people who have been killed. So it's really a complex space, but exciting in certain ways. And for me, it comes from a place of really admiring the work that activists are engaged in.
Great. So, no, not this one. I think this one was already.
No, it's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for your for accepting our invitation and coming here to talk about this very important topic. So I think we don't have more questions for now on YouTube. If you want to reach these authors, you can probably write them on Twitter or something. Am I right?
Yes.
Lauren,
yeah,
Catherine? Okay, perfect. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll definitely keep an eye on your projects, and thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
And we will.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time, and I hope you all stay really well and safe. We heard some stuff in our back office before, and we wish you all the best, and hear from you soon, hopefully. So we're going to announce now 2 more things, right? So as we are heading towards the summer break, and we are always here announcing our next event, this time we will share with our partner. Data Science Portugal is having a great event this weekend for free and online. And you should still register and join it. We've been there last year on live, what was, of course, way better. This time, sadly, it's online, but we really recommend it.
Still very good. Still very good.
And it's free. So, and beside that event, we both had 2-hour summer break, as well as most people, I think. We will keep on working with our stuff and hopefully prepare the next event. And just follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and you will see when the next event will be announced. And we all wish you to stay well, healthy, and enjoy the summer. Yeah. And thanks
See
for
you
joining.
in September. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Beijinhos. Até a
Adeus.
próxima.